What if leaving one place doesn't mean escaping your fears, but carrying them to the next road? Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're travelling beyond Sarpa with James and Diep, as a quiet journey turns into moments of vulnerability, unexpected danger, and choices that test how far trust can really go. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episodes on their journey. The morning in Sarpa arrives quietly, wrapped in a thick layer of fog that presses against the windows like a held breath. The town is still asleep, or at least pretending to be. From the small guest house room, the world outside looks muted and distant, as if it belongs to someone else. Diep is already awake. She sits on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her hands resting loosely on her knees. Her eyes are fixed on the glass, watching shapes move and disappear in the mist. Behind her, James stirs. He doesn't speak right away. He's learned that mornings like this don't need words. He sits up slowly, rubbing his eyes, then glances at Diep. She hasn't turned around, but she knows he's awake. She always does. Fog's thick today, he says softly, more to fill the space than to start a conversation. Diep nods. It always is, right before we leave. That makes James pause. He studies her reflection in the window. Her face is calm, but there's something heavier beneath it, something that didn't dissolve overnight. They pack in near silence, no rush, no checking the time every few minutes. James had planned to leave early, beat the traffic, get ahead on the road, but when he notices how slowly Diep folds her clothes, how deliberate each movement is, he quietly abandons the plan. The road will still be there. Outside, Sarpa feels colder than yesterday. The fog clings to their skin as they load the bags into the car. Diep takes one last look down the street. The shops are closed. No eyes watching this time. Still, her shoulders remain slightly tense. When they pull away, Sarpa disappears almost immediately, swallowed by white. For a long while, neither of them speaks. The engine hums steadily. The road curves and dips, slipping in and out of view. James keeps both hands on the wheel, his grip firm but unhurried. Diep rests her forehead lightly against the window, watching moisture trail downward in uneven lines. "Where are we going again?" she asks, her voice quiet. "Mukang Chai," James replies. "Not crowded. Open roads. We don't have to rush." She turns to look at him. "You changed the route." He nods. "Yeah." "Why?" James keeps his eyes forward. "Because this one doesn't rush us." Diep doesn't respond, but something in her expression softens. The car continues climbing, fog thinning as they move farther from Sarpa. The air changes, feels lighter, less compressed. As the road straightens, Diep's eyelids begin to droop. She fights it at first, blinking hard, shifting in her seat. Eventually her body gives in. Her head tips sideways, coming to rest gently against James's shoulder. James notices immediately. He stiffens for half a second, then relaxes. His right arm aches from holding the wheel at an awkward angle, but he doesn't adjust. He slows down instead, easing his speed just enough to make the ride smoother. Diep sleeps like that for nearly an hour. When she wakes, the fog is gone. Sunlight spills across rolling hills, illuminating layers of green that stretch into the distance. Terraced fields begin to appear, carved patiently into the mountainside. She straightens quickly, realizing where she is. "Sorry," she murmurs. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," James says. "You looked tired." She watches the landscape pass by. "If we keep moving," she says after a moment, "people won't have time to judge us." The words hang in the air, heavier than she intended. James exhales slowly. "Is that why you like travelling?" She considers it. "Maybe. When you stay too long somewhere, people start asking questions. When you move, you're just passing through." James is quiet for a few seconds. Then, without looking at her, he says, "Sometimes I worry about that." "About what?" "That one day, you'll get tired of moving with me." Diep turns fully toward him. "Why would you think that?" "Because I don't really offer stability," he admits. "Just roads, and places that don't last." She studies his face. It's the first time he's said something like this out loud. Vulnerable, unpolished. "As long as I'm moving with you," she says softly, "I'm not lost." James swallows, nodding once. They stop at a small roadside stall just before noon. A few wooden benches, a kettle steaming over a portable stove. An older woman pours them tea without asking many questions. No curious stares, no probing smiles, just warmth, quiet, and the sound of a wind moving through grass. As Diep wraps her hands around the cup, she shivers slightly. James notices and reaches for her hand instinctively, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. He doesn't announce it, doesn't look at her to see if it's okay. He just does it. She doesn't pull away. After they leave, the road narrows. Gravel replaces asphalt in places. The car slips once, tyres skidding briefly on loose stones. Diep gasps as the vehicle jerks to the side. James reacts instantly, steadying the wheel, guiding them back into control. The car stops a few meters later. Silence rushes in. "Are you okay?" he asks, turning toward her, panic flickering in his eyes. She nods, holding up her hand. A thin line of red runs across her palm where she scraped it against the door. It's small, barely bleeding, but James's face pales. "I'm fine," she insists. He pulls out the first aid kit anyway, hands shaking slightly as he cleans the cut. Diep watches him, surprised by the intensity of his focus. "You're more scared than I am," she says gently. "Yeah," he admits. "I guess I am." They continue on, more cautiously now. At another stop, a simple lunch place near the edge of the road, Diep realises something is missing. She checks her bag, then checks again, more urgently. "My wallet," she says. "It's not here." James stands immediately. "Are you sure?" She nods. "It was in the side pocket." They retrace their steps mentally. The tea stall, the stop after, the brief moment when she set her bag down. "It's okay," Diep says quietly. "I'm used to losing things." James looks at her sharply. That's not okay. He steps outside, scanning the area, already preparing to drive back if needed. When he returns, he meets her eyes. "Do you trust me?" he asks. "If we stay one more night to sort this out?" Diep hesitates. Then, slowly, she nods. They decide to stay. The choice isn't dramatic. There's no long discussion, no weighing of pros and cons. James simply turns the car around and Diep watches the road reverse itself through the windshield. The mountains don't seem to mind. They stay where they are, patient and unmoved, as if waiting to see what the two of them will do next. Neither of them speaks for a while. The small town they stop in feels quieter than Sarpa. Fewer lights, fewer people. A place that doesn't ask questions because it has learned not to expect answers. James parks near a modest guest house, the kind that looks like it's been standing there longer than it remembers. Inside, the room is simple. 2 chairs, a low table, a window that looks out onto nothing in particular. Diep sets her bag down slowly, as if it might disappear again if she's not careful. "I'm sorry," she says suddenly. James looks up. "For what?" "For causing trouble. We could have kept going." He shakes his head. "You didn't cause anything." She sits on the edge of the bed, shoulders slightly hunched. "Things like this always happen to me. Wherever I go, something goes missing. Money, papers, people." James sits across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then maybe the problem isn't you," he says. "Maybe it's that no one ever stayed long enough to help you look." Her throat tightens at that. Later, they walk back toward the roadside stall where they had stopped earlier. The light has shifted. Afternoon sun casts long shadows across the dirt road. The woman from the stall recognizes them immediately and listens quietly as James explains, using simple words and gestures. She nods once, disappears behind the stall, then returns holding a small wallet. Diep's breath catches. "It fell," the woman says, handing it back. "I kept it." Diep takes it with both hands, bowing her head slightly. "Thank you." Back outside, she opens it slowly. Everything is there. The money, the cards, and tucked inside a folded corner, a small photo she hadn't realised she'd been carrying for so long. James watches her carefully. You okay? She nods, but her eyes are distant. That evening they don't go far. They eat simple food, sit on the steps outside the guest house, and watch the sky change colours. The air is cooler now, but not harsh. Diep leans back, resting her weight against James without thinking. You know, she says quietly, when I lost it earlier, I wasn't scared. He looks at her. Why not? Because for the first time, I wasn't alone when it happened. James doesn't respond right away. He looks out at the darkening hills, then down at her hand resting near his. You don't have to get used to losing things, he says finally. Not with me. She turns her head slightly, meeting his gaze. There's a question there. Not spoken, but heavy. James, she begins, then stops. What? If one day I tell you I'm tired, not of travelling, but of running, what would you do? He thinks for a moment. I'd stop, he says, and I'd stay, even if you don't know where yet. Her eyes glisten, just a little. Night settles in fully. The mountains disappear into darkness, leaving only the sound of insects and distant wind. Inside the room, Diep washes her scraped hand at the sink. The cut is small, already healing. James stands nearby. Does it hurt? She shakes her head. Not anymore. She turns off the light, and for a moment they stand in the dim glow from the window. No rush. No plans for tomorrow spoken out loud. James reaches for her hand again, this time slower, more deliberate. She lets him. Outside, the road waits.
Chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.